From the very first moment the white tent appeared outside Nancy Guthrie's home, it felt as though the quiet, sun-washed calm of that Tucson neighborhood had suddenly been pierced by something deeply consequential, because a tent isn't erected in front of a front door without reason, especially not one this stark and deliberate, its clean canvas cutting a surreal silhouette against the familiar brick and desert landscaping, telling every neighbor within view that something had shifted in this case, that the reaction from law enforcement had entered a new phase, and that the unanswered questions, the thousands of tips, the released surveillance footage, and the relentless public appeals were no longer abstract forces, but real, physical momentum making itself visible in the world. Investigators set up that white tent at around 8:00 a.m., according to local reports, and almost immediately, the mood of the block changed. As residents craned their necks through curtains, reporters jockeyed for camera angles, and a quiet, uneasy curiosity spread like ripples on still water. Because for 12 days, the disappearance of 84-year-old Nancy, a woman with limited mobility and daily medication needs, had gripped not just a family but a nation, with law enforcement following a complex, emotionally fraught trail of scattered clues, bloody evidence on her porch that pointed to abduction, and a doorbell camera mysteriously tampered with on the night she vanished, a masked figure caught on recovered footage still haunting observers with the sense that someone knew more than they had revealed. The tent, at first glance, seemed like a simple protective measure, a way for investigators to shield whatever operation was underway from the probing eyes of the public and the glare of the midday sun. But once you stood back and observed it within the context of the broader investigation, it became clear that it was far more than just a piece of equipment or a canvas canopy. It was a symbol of uncertainty giving way to determined inquiry, the physical embodiment of a case shifting from widespread canvas to targeted, methodical attention, signaling that experts were zeroing in on a precise location, behavior patterns, or perhaps evidence that could only be properly documented when shielded from wind, heat, or casual scrutiny. The psychology behind erecting such a structure in front of a residence is telling. It announces seriousness, it preserves scene integrity, and it acknowledges that what happens under that white canvas could be pivotal to unraveling the mystery of a disappearance that has already defied dozens of leads and tens of thousands of calls, because authorities report having received nearly 18,000 pieces of information since the case began. There's a visceral moment that often comes in investigations like this when abstract concern morphs into focused action, and the tent is that moment for the Nancy Guthrie case, because up until now the search was marked by broad sweeps. Drones over Catalina foothills, K-9 units combing terrain, tips pouring into tip lines, and releases of disturbing surveillance images. But a tent at the front porch signals an archaeological layer of investigation, as though detectives have identified a locus that demands controlled access, meticulous documentation, and a protective barrier around whatever they are examining, even if officials have been intentionally tight-lipped about what exactly is happening beneath it. The field journalists on the scene noted that it went up early in the morning, almost as if agents worked overnight to prepare and coordinate, a silent prelude to what experts describe in their own language of procedural rhythm as a targeted forensic operation, where each disciplined movement counts and the air itself seems heavier with expectation. Inside that tent, there could be any number of things, from a carefully staged scanning of minute physical evidence to the examination of structural elements of the home that may have been overlooked in earlier searches, or perhaps the collection of materials that, when exposed to direct daylight or uncontrolled conditions, might degrade faster than investigators are comfortable allowing. The very presence of the canvas shelter suggests that what is being handled right now is too important to risk contamination or exposure, that it merits not just attention, but an environment that can be regulated for both human activity and forensic integrity. And that is a powerful statement in a case like this, because it implies a seriousness, a method, and a level of interpretive strategy that goes beyond the initial stages of a missing person search, pushing toward a deeper, more targeted form of inquiry. The tent becomes a lens through which the public and analysts alike begin to rethink what they know, what they don't know, and what law enforcement might have seen in the data, whether it is spatial evidence, material traces, or connections that only now have been drawn together into a pattern that justifies such a procedural investment. Emotionally and psychologically, for those following the case, the tent acts as both beacon and mystery. A beacon for renewed hope that this could be the moment when scattered leads coalesce into clarity, and a mystery because officials have been guarded about confirming why it was put up, pushing the narrative into a tension space where speculation grows faster than verified facts and where every onlooker imagines worst and best scenarios in equal measure. Neighbors described the scene with a kind of stunned acceptance, noting that until now, law enforcement had been methodical but spread across landscapes and roadways. Now, the focus seemed pinpointed, and the tent stood like a declaration that whatever happens next has the weight of procedure behind it and the gaze of public attention in front of it. This duality of visible control and hidden information is what gives the visuals such narrative power, because it transforms an everyday suburban setting into a scene that feels charged with consequence, where transparency and concealment play their own silent game, each breath of wind against the fabric, a reminder that beneath the surface, something is unfolding that might finally move the needle in the search for Nancy. But the tent also raises deeper questions about expectation and perception, because in high-profile cases like this, every move by law enforcement is interpreted through the lens of anxiety, hope, and cultural storytelling. What does this mean? Is evidence finally found? Did they uncover a clue only now surfacing? Is the proximity of the tent to the front entry symbolic of a breakthrough? Or is it simply a protective measure against environmental conditions? The human mind fills gaps rapidly when faced with uncertainty, and analysts caution against jumping to conclusions based solely on visuals. Authoritative sources make clear that the search continues on multiple fronts, from the Capitol Hills of Tucson to the roads near Catalina foothills, and that while this visual development is notable, it must be contextualized within the larger, layered effort involving dozens of detectives, FBI agents, and forensic teams piecing together chronology, physical evidence, and public tips. Context is everything here. Investigators have already released surveillance footage of a masked, armed individual tampering with a doorbell camera at the moment Nancy disappeared. They have conducted court-authorized searches of multiple locations, including a home in Rio Rico, and a person detained earlier was released without charges after questioning, all pointing to a complex, evolving search that has consumed resources and attention without yet providing definitive resolution. The appearance of the tent, therefore, is not an isolated act, but part of a continuum, a visible next step in a long, emotionally fraught narrative that includes blood evidence at the original home, ransom note speculation, and ongoing pleas from Savannah Guthrie and her family that their mother is still alive and in need of public help to be found. Ultimately, the white tent's presence becomes a story unto itself, not for what we definitively know it contains or represents, but for how it reframes the emotional, procedural, and perceptual landscape of the investigation. It is the tangible marker of a case that has defied simple answers, the physical manifestation of an inquiry stretching through days without resolution, and a reminder that real investigations are not linear, but layered, non-linear, and often unpredictable. In the shadows of that canvas, investigators may be conducting painstaking, meticulous work, far from the noise of speculation and rumor, but deeply rooted in strategy and evidence. And that tension between the seen and unseen, between hope and patience, is precisely what holds the gaze of observers, urging them to watch closely, think deeply, and engage not with conclusion, but with the ongoing pursuit of truth. Because in moments like this, the difference between fear and understanding lies not in the presence of a white tent, but in how we choose to interpret it as part of a larger human story that is still being written. By the time the afternoon sun began casting longer shadows across the driveway, the white tent no longer looked temporary. It looked deliberate, rooted, almost symbolic, as if it had become the silent center of gravity in a case that has already stretched across neighborhoods, desert terrain, and national headlines. And what makes this moment so compelling is not simply the structure itself, but the shift in tempo it represents. Because investigations move in phases, and anyone who has followed complex missing person cases understands that when authorities return to the original scene with renewed intensity, it usually means one of two things. Either something new has been discovered that reframes the timeline, or existing evidence is being re-examined under a sharper lens, and both possibilities carry enormous weight in a case involving an 84-year-old woman whose disappearance was marked from the beginning by disturbing indicators of forced entry and struggle.
The psychological impact of that return to the scene cannot be overstated. It signals that the starting point still holds answers, that the narrative arc of the investigation may circle back to its origin, and that detectives are not merely chasing tips across counties, but digging deeper into the core event itself, dissecting every inch of space, every fiber, every trace that might have been overlooked in the frantic first hours when urgency often competes with clarity.
There is also the subtle choreography of law enforcement behavior that seasoned observers pick up on. The way vehicles are positioned, the number of personnel entering and exiting the tent, the calm but focused demeanor of officers who understand that cameras are watching but whose attention remains fixed on the task at hand. And this is where analysis becomes essential, because in high-profile cases, the public often looks for dramatic gestures. Yet real investigative breakthroughs are usually quiet, procedural, almost clinical, unfolding behind barriers precisely like this one. The tent creates a controlled environment, not just physically, but narratively. It slows speculation by limiting visibility while simultaneously intensifying curiosity, a paradox that fuels discussion online, where theories multiply in the absence of confirmed details, and yet authorities have remained measured, reiterating that the search remains active, that no conclusions have been announced, and that their focus continues to be on locating Nancy and understanding exactly what transpired during the critical window when surveillance footage captured a masked individual interfering with the home's camera system. What deepens the tension in this unfolding chapter is the timeline itself, because days have now passed since the initial disappearance, and with each passing hour, the stakes feel heavier, especially considering Nancy's age and reported need for medication, factors that investigators have openly acknowledged as urgent concerns. When law enforcement circles back with a forensic tent at this stage, it suggests either preservation of newly identified evidence or reanalysis triggered by fresh intelligence. Perhaps a tip that narrowed focus, perhaps digital data that revealed a new detail, perhaps a forensic inconsistency that demanded a second look. And while officials have not specified which, the very act of shielding the porch area signals an operation that requires meticulous documentation, careful lighting control, and protection from environmental interference. All hallmarks of evidence processing that is methodical rather than reactive. This is not chaos. This is strategy unfolding in real time. Community reaction adds another emotional layer, because neighbors who once experienced the search as distant activity in surrounding areas now see it concentrated directly at the source, and that proximity transforms curiosity into something more personal, more immediate. It's one thing to read updates online. It's another to watch investigators step beneath a white canopy just steps away from where you greet your mail carrier each morning, and that closeness amplifies empathy for the family while also intensifying the sense that answers, however difficult they may be, could be approaching. At the same time, it's critical to resist the narrative trap that equates visible action with definitive discovery. In many investigations, renewed forensic attention is part of due diligence, ensuring that nothing is missed as broader search efforts continue across multiple jurisdictions. There's also a broader investigative pattern worth noting. Earlier reports confirmed that law enforcement executed court-authorized searches in other locations and questioned individuals connected to leads, actions that demonstrate a widening net. And when such outward expansion is paired with a renewed inward focus at the original scene, it often reflects a synthesis phase, where data from various sources begins converging, prompting reevaluation of the physical site in light of new context. Analysts frequently describe this as the cross-reference moment, when digital clues, witness accounts, and forensic traces are layered together to test consistency, and if inconsistencies emerge, investigators return to the ground to reconcile them. The tent may very well represent that reconciliation process, a physical manifestation of detectives asking, did we see everything? Did we interpret this correctly? What might we have missed? From a storytelling perspective, the image is powerful because it stands at the intersection of hope and dread. Hope because renewed focus implies determination and persistence. Dread because the unknown beneath the canvas invites imagination. And yet responsible analysis demands we separate visual drama from verified fact. Authorities have not indicated that the tent signifies a conclusive finding, nor have they publicly disclosed the specific task being conducted beneath it. And that silence, while frustrating for a public eager for resolution, is often necessary to protect the integrity of an active investigation. In cases of this magnitude, premature disclosure can compromise evidence, influence witness testimony, or even alert individuals who may be under scrutiny. So restraint, though uncomfortable, is frequently strategic. What remains undeniable is that the white tent has altered the psychological landscape of this case. It marks a visible pivot point, a chapter shift that reminds us investigations are living processes rather than linear scripts, evolving with each new piece of information and recalibrated by professionals whose job is to separate signal from noise. As viewers and commentators, Our role is not to leap ahead of facts, but to observe patterns, analyze responsibly, and acknowledge the human gravity at the center of this story. A family waiting, a community watching, and investigators working deliberately beneath a structure that shields their efforts from public view. If there is a lesson embedded in this moment, it is that patience and precision often coexist in tension, and sometimes the most significant developments are those carried out quietly behind white canvas walls while the world holds its breath and waits for clarity. Part 3. As evening settled over the neighborhood and the harsh daylight softened into a muted glow, the white tent seemed to take on an even heavier presence, illuminated by portable lights that cast long, deliberate shadows across the driveway, transforming the home's entrance into a controlled investigative chamber where every movement beneath that canopy carried the weight of precision. And it is in these quieter hours, when media noise dips slightly and the hum of activity becomes more methodical, that the true character of an investigation reveals itself, because what looks dramatic from afar is often painstakingly technical up close, with gloved hands cataloging fragments, measuring distances, documenting angles, and reconstructing sequences in a disciplined effort to turn fragments of uncertainty into structured understanding. Observers noted that personnel rotations appeared steady and organized, suggesting sustained work rather than a brief inspection, and that detail alone reinforces the idea that this phase is not symbolic but substantive, a deliberate continuation of a case that has already demanded extensive coordination between local authorities, federal agents, and forensic specialists determined to piece together a timeline that began with a masked individual on surveillance footage and escalated into one of the region's most closely watched missing person investigations. There is something psychologically profound about investigators returning repeatedly to the origin point of a disappearance, because it signals that the beginning still holds secrets, that the first chapter of this story may contain overlooked nuance, and seasoned analysts often emphasize that crime scenes, or potential crime scenes, are rarely static. They evolve as context evolves, meaning that evidence dismissed as peripheral on day one may become central once new intelligence emerges. And this cyclical return is not a sign of confusion, but of rigor, an acknowledgement that understanding deepens over time, especially when thousands of tips flood in and digital breadcrumbs begin aligning with physical realities. The tent, therefore, becomes less about concealment and more about recalibration, a structured environment where hypotheses can be tested against tangible details without interference from wind, dust, or public observation, ensuring that whatever conclusions are drawn rest on controlled analysis rather than hurried assumption. At the heart of this unfolding chapter is the tension between visibility and confidentiality, because the public can see the tent, but not the task, can witness the posture of investigators, but not the specifics of what they are collecting or examining, and that gap naturally fuels speculation. Yet it also underscores the professionalism required in cases where premature disclosure could jeopardize progress. Authorities have consistently framed this as an active and evolving investigation, and the renewed forensic attention aligns with that framing. Active means ongoing, evolving means adaptive, and adaptive investigations often circle back to reassess foundational evidence as new patterns emerge. It's entirely possible that forensic technologies, data analysis, or witness statements have prompted a second look at entry points, structural elements, or trace materials. And such re-examinations are common in complex cases where early urgency gives way to deeper, slower scrutiny. But meanwhile, the family's public appeals add emotional gravity to the scene, because while investigators operate within protocol and documentation, loved ones experience time differently. Each hour stretching with uncertainty, each development carrying both hope and fear, and the sight of a white tent at the family home inevitably intensifies that emotional landscape, symbolizing both action and unanswered questions. It's a delicate balance for law enforcement, demonstrating visible effort to reassure the public while safeguarding details that must remain confidential, and the tent walks that line perfectly, transparent in presence, yet opaque in purpose. That duality is precisely why it has become such a focal point in coverage. It is a visual anchor in a narrative otherwise defined by invisible processes and withheld specifics. Analytically, one must consider the broader investigative ecosystem surrounding this case: court-authorized searches in other locations, individuals questioned and released, digital evidence recovered, and thousands of public tips sifted through, because investigations of this magnitude are rarely linear. They branch outward and loop inward, gathering data from multiple directions before converging again at key physical sites. When convergence happens, it often signals synthesis, the stage where disparate pieces begin interacting in meaningful ways, prompting renewed scrutiny of original assumptions. The tent may represent exactly that synthesis stage, a moment where digital insight meets physical verification, where theories are tested against tangible evidence beneath controlled conditions designed to preserve accuracy. There is also a subtle but important shift in public perception when an investigation becomes visibly concentrated. Early stages often feel expansive, marked by search grids and public bulletins, but concentrated forensic activity narrows focus, suggesting that investigators may be honing in on specific variables rather than casting a wide net. That narrowing can be interpreted as progress, though progress does not always equate to resolution. And it is crucial to maintain that distinction. Responsible analysis avoids equating action with outcome. Instead, it recognizes action as part of an iterative process, one that demands patience even as it commands attention. The tent, in this sense, is not a conclusion but a checkpoint, a structured pause in which investigators verify, document, and possibly reinterpret what they know so far. As night deepens and the tent remains illuminated against the darkness, it becomes almost emblematic of persistence. A beacon that says the search has not stalled, that even as headlines cycle and speculation swells, methodical work continues beneath canvas walls, shielded from view, yet driven by purpose. And perhaps that is the most telling insight of all. In an age where instant answers are expected and viral narratives form within minutes, the most meaningful developments often unfold quietly, protected from spectacle, guided by professionals who understand that clarity is earned through diligence rather than declared through drama. If this moment teaches us anything, it is that patience, restraint, and careful analysis are not signs of stagnation, but of seriousness. And as this case continues to evolve, the presence of that white tent reminds us that behind every developing headline lies a disciplined process working steadily toward truth, one measured step at a time. Part 4. By the following morning, the white tent no longer felt like a sudden development. It felt like a turning point, a fixed landmark in a case that had until now seemed fluid and sprawling. And what stood out most was not urgency but endurance, because investigators were still there, still moving with that same controlled rhythm, reinforcing the idea that whatever is being processed beneath that canopy requires time, precision, and perhaps repeated verification. And when law enforcement commits extended hours to a contained forensic space at the original site of disappearance, seasoned analysts recognize that as a signal of depth rather than display. The driveway, once a simple residential entryway, had effectively become a micro-laboratory, a transitional zone where field collection meets analytical reconstruction, and that transformation carries symbolic weight. It suggests that the story's next answers may not lie miles away in rugged terrain, but within feet of where the first signs of disturbance were reported. What complicates the narrative and makes it so gripping is the known backdrop of this case. Earlier reports describe blood evidence at the scene, surveillance footage showing a masked individual tampering with a camera, and thousands of public tips flooding in, all forming a mosaic that is both alarming and incomplete. And when investigators revisit that original mosaic under controlled conditions, it implies either that new pieces have been added to the picture or that the original arrangement is being reconsidered. In complex investigations, breakthroughs are often born not from brand new discoveries, but from reinterpretation of existing evidence in light of fresh context. And the tent can be viewed as the physical embodiment of that reinterpretation phase, a barrier erected not to dramatize, but to concentrate, to narrow variables, to ensure that environmental factors like wind, heat, or contamination do not distort what could be minute but decisive traces. There is also the matter of optics, and optics matter profoundly in high-profile cases because the public reads symbolism into visuals whether intended or not, and a white tent carries cultural weight. It evokes seriousness, sensitivity, sometimes finality, but professionals caution against attaching predetermined meaning to a tool of procedure. Forensic tents are used for many reasons: to shield evidence from weather, to preserve privacy during delicate operations, to create controlled lighting conditions, or simply to maintain scene integrity during extended documentation. The presence of such a structure does not automatically signal a singular outcome. It signals method, and method is the backbone of credible investigation. Yet in the court of public perception, visuals often outpace nuance, which is why measured commentary becomes essential in moments like this. From a behavioral standpoint, the steadiness of the investigative team is telling. There have been no abrupt evacuations, no visible escalation, no public declarations of discovery. just quiet continuity, and continuity in this context suggests diligence rather than shock. If something dramatically conclusive had occurred, the energy around the site would likely shift in tone, but what observers describe instead is disciplined focus, a sustained effort that aligns more with verification than revelation. That distinction matters because it frames expectations appropriately. This appears to be a phase of confirmation and documentation rather than a dramatic unveiling, and in many investigations, such phases are where the groundwork for future announcements is laid. Meanwhile, the broader search remains active, and that parallel effort is crucial to understanding the full picture. While forensic specialists work under the tent, search teams continue canvassing areas of interest, investigators analyze digital data, and tips are cross-referenced, illustrating that the tent is one component of a multi-layered strategy rather than an isolated response. Complex cases rarely hinge on a single location alone. They are ecosystems of information where physical evidence, technological analysis, and human testimony intersect. The tent may represent a convergence point in that ecosystem, a site where threads from various leads meet for validation. But it does not eclipse the other ongoing dimensions of the investigation. Emotionally, this stage is perhaps the most challenging for the public to process because visible action without explicit explanation creates a vacuum that speculation eagerly fills. And yet restraint is precisely what ensures integrity. Premature disclosure can distort witness accounts, compromise prosecutorial pathways, or even hinder rescue efforts if foul play is suspected. Law enforcement's measured silence, while frustrating to some, aligns with best practices in active cases, especially those involving vulnerable individuals. The tension between transparency and confidentiality is delicate, and the tent underscores that balance. It is transparent in presence, yet confidential in purpose, reminding observers that not all progress can be publicly narrated in real time. As the days continue and the tent remains a focal image circulating through news feeds and social platforms, it has come to symbolize more than a procedural tool. It symbolizes persistence, the refusal to abandon a lead, the commitment to revisit, reassess, and re-examine until clarity emerges. And perhaps that is the deeper insight here. Investigations are not dramatic arcs that climax on cue. They are iterative, disciplined pursuits where progress is often invisible until it is ready to be revealed. The white tent at Nancy Guthrie's home may not yet tell us what has been found, but it tells us something equally important: that the search for truth is active, methodical, and ongoing, and in a case defined by uncertainty, that sustained, deliberate effort is itself a powerful statement.